In this video, we're going to talk about the different types of perspectives you can use in your stories or your novels. So I want to first talk to you a bit about 4%, which is the story that you gave feedback on in the first unit of this course. So 4%, one of the reasons why I picked that story for you to work on was because it used a unique perspective. It used the second person, which puts the reader in the role of the character within the story by using the word you. And you is potentially a dangerous option for your perspective because it can alienate the reader. If the reader can't automatically relate to the content of your story or your novel, if they feel disconnected, or if there's a trip in the psychology of that perspective, meaning you say that you do something that you would not actually ever do, or that the reader would not actually ever do, then you inadvertently alienate your reader and you've lost control of the narrative. They're no longer with you in that perspective as they go. So when you're thinking about which perspective to use, if you're considering second person, you want to make that decision very carefully, because of that potential for alienation. Now, in a story like 4%, that potentially works because the goal of that story was to make the reader feel like they were a redhead, that they were experiencing what redheads experience. And so in that scenario, second person might work. There are additional perspectives that we're going to consider as well. Now let's consider the different types of third-person narrator you have. Third person means you're referring to the characters by he or she or z if you're being non-gender specific with your pronouns. So limited third person is one version of third person in which one or more of the characters is telling the story from his or her perspective, but they have a limited view into the world of the other person. That is, in this scenario, perhaps the male character knows about the female character, but he can't get inside her head. He doesn't know what she's thinking. So the author or the narrator can't really discuss what that character's thoughts are. Now that is in contrast to the omniscient third-person narrative. In this version, the narrator knows everything. They are still using third person, he or she or z, and they can see inside the characters' heads. They can see everything that the character is doing, including things the character doesn't know about. For instance, in Romeo and Juliet, at the end of the play, Romeo rushes in and sees Juliet lying on the pyre, and he thinks that she's dead, but the audience actually knows she's not. That's an omniscient third narrative. That means that we knew something that the characters did not know. The same thing can happen with the narrator. First-person narrative or first-person perspective refers to characters that are referring to themselves, or an I or a me is determining the perspective of the story. And in that case, it's still limited because unless that character is psychic, the character only knows what they're feeling, what they're thinking. They can't guess at what somebody else is thinking. So when you use that I perspective, you can do so even if it's fiction. And when you take on a character and you start speaking in that I, it can get very confusing. You may relate it to yourself, so be careful with that.
One of the biggest mistakes that I see when students or amateur writers or new to the writing world try to write narrative or stories is a shift in perspective. And point of view should remain consistent throughout the book. That's not to say that you can't have multiple points of views in a story, but it is to say that one point of view should be the driving force within a given chapter or a given moment. So let's look at this paragraph here. Tony looked at Carol. He could tell she was frustrated. She decided then to tell him what she thought. Here we have conflicting perspective. Tony, he, and then she. The first sentence, Tony looked at Carol, we know is Tony's perspective. The second sentence, he could tell she was frustrated. We know it's still Tony's perspective. He's describing how he feels about Carol. But then suddenly the writer jumps in here with Carol's perspective. Suddenly it's she. She decides then to tell him what she thinks. Now, because this shift in perspective happens in a single paragraph or even in a single chapter, What this does is it jars the reader on a subconscious level because the reader is no longer sure with whom they should be connecting. An example of a corrected paragraph would be, Tony looked at Carol, Tony subject. He could tell she was frustrated, he subject. New paragraph, she decided then to tell him what she thought. So now you've got two different perspectives in one chapter. And from this angle, this would be omniscient third person, because you can see everything that's going on. You have multiple perspectives working in the same story. You've got Tony and you've got Carol, and you can see both of their thought patterns in the story, which means the narrator knows everything.